We're going to start doing some more draft content up on this channel. You know, we've been doing a lot of player breakdowns and the 2026 players. Cashius Howell, for example, we uploaded this week. But a lot of those videos, they're kind of a bit more team-oriented right now. I want a place where we can talk about 4 or 5 players a week and just kind of talk about the seasons they've been having and the weeks that they had and how that's going to play into their draft process in 2026, you know, this upcoming draft. So we got 4 names on here, you know, 5 names listed. We're not going to talk about Nate Frazier today. It's a guy that's not even eligible until 2027, the Georgia running back. But we're going to focus on Mendoza, Howell, Rodriguez, and Yhonzae Pierre. And this is from the website we've been developing, we-draft.com. It's kind of a place to store all your evaluations. I'm not going to give you the whole sales pitch right now, but if you see the interface, you know, that's what we'll be using. So for Fernando Mendoza, we don't have any highlights up. The other players, we do have highlights up on the YouTube channel. We just, the Big Ten's a bit draconian, we'll say, about the videos that they let up on their channel. But we'll just use this for now. But we will have video reference for Cashius Howell and the other players when we get there. But just talking about the week Mendoza had against Penn State, you know, this was a guy that's been getting mocked all season, first overall, really since the first 3 weeks, how good of a season he's been having. And this Penn State game was the first one that I really watched in depth. So, you know, when I'm giving you my opinion, just please realize I understand it's not completely formed yet, right? We still have a lot of time to watch the entire season in its totality. And, you know, the pre-draft interviews, although that's not something that you're going to worry about, Fernando Mendoza, and the combine, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to give my opinion on what I saw in the Penn State game. So 6'5", 225, I absolutely love the frame Fernando Mendoza has. You hear him interview on the sideline after the games. Great personality as well. You know, a lot of these, I feel like a lot of these guys in the first round, the quarterbacks over the past, you know, 10 years since I've been following, every now and then they're, you know, it's kind of a box you have to check with a lot of players. I don't think this is just a box you have to check. It's like when you put an exclamation point in, you know, the personality that Fernando Mendoza has. That's a big thing. You know, other positions, I think you can get away with being a dickhead, you know, as an edge rusher, as a receiver. Honestly, I'd prefer my receiver or my edge rusher to be a dickhead than I would, you know, him being a guy that little kids look up to. Fernando Mendoza is not that. I think at quarterback you do need a Superman, a good human type player, if that makes sense. And that in that regard, Fernando Mendoza checks the box. 6'5", 225, absolutely love the frame. This dude's going to be able to take on hits at the next level. You know, he's got a very good vision of the field, and I think that all starts with him being 6'5". So what are you getting in with Fernando Mendoza? I absolutely love this dude on script. You know, the progressions happen so fast. He's athletic enough to get it done, sure. I like the arm as well, too. You know, I'm not sure how much I like the arm yet. I'm going to have to think about it a bit more, but certainly, like, I think the timing on the routes, that kind of makes me think how fast the ball he gets out, quick release as well. I think that kind of makes me overrate the arm just a little bit right now. You know, I'm not sure yet. We definitely like the arm. We just don't know to what extent we like the arm. So that'll be something we'll talk about going forward. But what I'm not really worried about that at all. I think the arm is the reason he's going to go in the first round. The processing, the frame, you know, the personality as well. Like we said, that does matter. The one thing that I don't know whether we're going to be talking about it as a positive with Mendoza is kind of the off-script stuff. So he's a good enough athlete, you know, to get up in the pocket. Dude, one thing in this Penn State game, you know, I can forgive the interception. He made one bad interception where he's kind of rolling out to his right. It was off-script, definitely, you know, kind of not a progression throw, you know, one of those where, you know, the play breaks down, he's got to find somebody downfield. He tries to hit a comeback, and the Penn State safety just cuts underneath it. That was the interception, if I remember right. I don't know if that guy actually got in bounds, but, you know, regardless, it was a bad throw. I can forgive that stuff. You know, that's something that we'll talk about. We're not sure how good of an off-script player Fernando Mendoza is. I'll keep thinking about it, and I'll get back to you on that one. The one thing in this Penn State game that I think was tangible of a negative, that was tangible enough of a negative to talk about, was kind of that feel of the pressure. You know, there was a couple plays throughout the game, and I try to give him the benefit of the doubt, you know, that it was one play. And it was just time and time again in this Penn State game where he was almost oblivious, you know, to that pass rush coming in. And there was one play early in the game where, you know, a dude came in unblocked. I'm not going to give that on him, but there was one in the last drive of the game, which he did a great job of, by the way, you know, having a slow heartbeat, driving Indiana down the field and scoring the touchdown to win the game against Penn State last week. That was a great job by him, but there was one play in that drive, you know, where he just it was just a horrible sack that he took from the backside. So, you know, that's the one thing with Mendoza that I think is going to leverage or be kind of a focal point of where he's drafted is how do we feel about him feeling the pressure, you know. And that all extends into the off-script stuff. He's definitely athletic enough to break the pocket and find guys downfield. That's not what I'm worried about. It's just more of, that feel for the pocket. And, this is also a guy that, a lot of people care about not having that big of a track record. That's one thing that people will say are going to work against him. I'm not so sure I get too caught up in that, but I do think that you can see this guy hasn't played as much football as some other quarterbacks in this 26 class, or just quarterbacks in general across college football, and you can tell that based on the way that he feels the pocket. And I say this all the time, and you guys are probably sick of hearing me say it, but you just cannot drill live pass rush reps in practice, dude. Mendoza's going to have a red jersey on in practice. I guess at Indiana, a black jersey or whatever they wear in practice. They're not hitting him in practice. You're not actually staked until you start playing in an actual Big Ten football game where they're trying to take your head off. And I just think in this Penn State game, that's really the one negative that stuck out to me. He took 3 sacks. He could have got sacked more, and he almost lost the game at the end when he took a blindside. And he actually did fumble it, but they ruled it an incomplete pass or whatever it was, so he didn't fumble it. But that was the one thing, and he's got the frame to take those shots. If this dude was 5'10", Kyler Murray, and he was taking shots like that, this dude was even like 6'2", a lot less than 230 pounds that he's pushing, I'd be worried about it long term. But I just think that's something that teams will have to, think about, and I'll have to think about it too. It was one game, it was Penn State, but that's the one thing I noticed. At the end of the day, I'm getting excited about this dude. Before I really watched him, a month ago, I was like, man, this quarterback class kind of fell off. I was so excited for Levitt, so excited for Sellers, especially in this 26th class, and they just haven't been having those seasons to justify taking them first overall. And Mendoza's been the guy that kind of, rised up. And, I watched him at Cal last year. That Cal team was awful. They were one of that awful Florida State team. That was one of the only losses was against Mendoza. So this dude's really came on, and I think he deserves all the hype that he's been getting. There's no doubt about that, after watching the film. The arm I like, and the processing, all that kind of stuff. We're going to have to talk about that, and we have a while. Thank God we don't have the draft tomorrow because I think we need a bit more time to really give our final opinion on Fernando Mendoza. But, yeah, that's my thoughts. We'll move on. A&M edge rusher Cashius Howell's been having a great season. We do have the film reference this time, so we'll not really narrate it. If you kind of want content where we're looking at every individual play, we got those uploaded, the LSU game, and then whoever the hell they just played. We got that all uploaded. But I'll just talk about him as a football player, right? Texas A&M, 10.5 sacks so far this season. He's having a great year, 6'2", 248 edge rusher. This dude is an edge rusher. He's a pass rusher. I'm not so sure we're going to get that much out of him as a run defender. So that's something you're going to have to kind of understand, that if your team's drafting Cashius Howell, I don't know about this dude's upside ever as an edge defender. So, I brought that up in one of these videos, and one of these guys said, yeah, but if you're drafting him, the pass rush alone is worth a first-round pick. That's a good conversation. 6'2.5", I think we said he was. He's definitely undersized as an edge rusher, and this game against Missouri, he had a rough game setting the edge throughout the entire game. I think Ahmad Hardy, Jamal Roberts, their 2 running backs, both broke 100 yards. It wasn't only Cashius Howell's fault, but there's a lot of clips throughout that entire game where, he just was not setting the edge. So, that's a good point. All right, you're not going to get a run defender, but is he worth a first-round pick as a pass rusher alone? Remains to be seen. The only reason I would say no is because David Bailey's in this class, and he is, an athletic freak as well. And I just don't know if you got a guy, if you're between Howell and David Bailey, the Texas Tech edge rusher, I'm not sure that you would take Howell just because David Bailey's actually giving you something against the run, and he's still a freak as a pass rusher. So, now they both can go in the first round, sure. So I'm just not sure exactly where this dude gets drafted. But talking about him as an edge rusher, this LSU game, I think alone you're going to think about getting him drafted just based on what he did against LSU. So the first step is great. I can't wait to see this dude in the combine. The dude's getting the vertical, the broad jump, all the testing, the 40-yard dash, the 10-yard split, everything. He's just going to test out of the building, and then we see him do the drills on the field. Just how twitched up of a pass rusher he is. That first step is so great, and then that closing speed as well. We saw it on that first clip against LSU. Just how fast he gets into the backfield, and then the ability to turn around the corner as well. So that bend, that he has, that definitely is working for him. And then I also like the pass rush moves we see. He has that nasty ghost move that we're going to see right here, the way he can just dip and get around the corner and get to the quarterback. And then he has another move in his back pocket where he can then go to the inside. I mean, you see just how flexible this dude is. So when you have that game where he's either going to the outside or to the inside, that's really lethal. I really like that for Cashius Howell. The one thing is, like, you watch David Bailey, he does that too, but he can also kind of convert that speed to power. So does it really matter? I do think it does. We'll see. He had a really good game against Missouri as well. I'm going to have to think about it more. You guys let me know what you think about Cashius Howell. Like, it's less about how good of a football player Cashius Howell is, and it's more about what is his skill set worth in the NFL, And if a team just needs a guy to get after the quarterback, this is certainly a guy that's going to get after the quarterback at a high clip at the next level. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that Cashius Howell has the ability to get after the quarterback at the next level. I mean, just look at this move here. It's just more what kind of defense are you running? In a four-man front, this dude's not going to set the edge. If you have a 3-4 and you want him to be the outside linebacker, then that's a good conversation to have, because I do think that's where he fills in. We see him pass drop every now and then. He does a pretty good job of that, but that's a bit more of a developmental thing with him long term. So it's the scheme that you run, and then what are you looking for in an edge rusher at the next level. But moving on, we're going to talk about Texas Tech linebacker Jacob Rodriguez. There's people talking about this guy should be in the Heisman contention. I said it in the video that we did about Jacob Rodriguez, but the last linebackers, I double checked this to make sure I was right. The last linebacker to be a Heisman finalist to actually get invited to New York was Jabril Peppers. He doesn't count, right? I mean, this dude was kick returning, punt returning for Michigan. He had a great season. He was a great player, but I don't know if he was really a linebacker. And before that, Manti Te'o, obviously, whatever happened there, I'm not going to get into all that, but he had a great season, obviously, at Notre Dame. He was a Heisman finalist as well. But Jacob Rodriguez is having a great season. He had 14 tackles against BYU, and 14 tackles, dude, it's an awful, I use the stats just to talk about it because people get excited about stats. Tackles is an awful way to gauge how good a football player is, but every now and then, if you actually watch the film, this dude has a very big impact over this Texas Tech defense. So this game against BYU, just put yourself in BYU's offensive coordinator, in their head coach's shoes. If you're facing Texas Tech, who has a great pass rusher, Melahite, David Bailey, we just talked about him. Two great pass rushers. What are you going to do? You're going to run the ball with the freshman quarterback on the road. Even BYU's offense, they were talking about in the broadcast. This is an offense that's not designed to get down 2 scores. So, they wanted to run the ball. They wanted to play a bit more of a game possession game, ball control, ball possession game. They just could not do that because Jacob Rodriguez was all over the field. The other linebacker, I don't know his name, number 13, had a great game as well. But, they tried to stretch the field. They tried to run power down the middle. They just couldn't do it because Rodriguez was everywhere. We're going to see on a lot of these stretch plays. So talk about Rodriguez as a draft player, what he does well, why he's going to get drafted early. Dude, I love the arm length. You can see how long this dude is. I'm very curious to see how strong of a football player he is. The one thing I've noticed, he has a bit of a difficulty getting off of blocks, but a lot of times he's so fast downhill, he's so fast getting sideline to sideline that he can kind of get around, not being the best at getting off of blocks right now because he beats the offensive linemen to their marks. He does a really good job of that. You can see here just how fast he gets sideline to sideline. The frame as well. I think he's listed at 6'3", but he's a bit longer than that with the arm length. So I love him as a pass dropper as well. Does a really good job. We're going to see in a clip a little bit. BYU didn't pass the ball, but when they did, and when Jacob Rodriguez wasn't blitzing, he did a really good job getting into his pass drops. And you see this interception right here that he had. Just that athleticism. The overall athletic profile is good. I think where he gets drafted is going to be a bit more of how strong of a football player he is. Is he a first-round pick? I don't think so. I'm going to tell you right now. You have to be pretty good as an off-ball linebacker to get drafted in the first round. And, the only one that's really a lock right now to me, I'll have to watch more C.J. Allen, but, it's obviously Arvell Reese, and that's just because that dude's such a good pass rusher. Even if Arvell Reese didn't blitz, I'm not sure we'd be talking about him as a first rounder if he wasn't an edge rusher, just because of that value that those inside linebackers have. But, yeah, he's a bit of an older prospect also. They talk a lot about him used to play quarterback. I think he was at Virginia before Texas Tech, and that kind of helps him as a pass dropper. But, the way that this dude reads run schemes and then that athleticism to kind of get him to the mark, first seeing where he has to go and then actually getting there. I think that's what gets you excited about Jacob Rodriguez as a draft guy. So, day 2, yeah, sure. Second round pick, third round pick, sure. Just don't know if we're going to be talking about this guy worth a first round pick just because he's a linebacker. But that's not me downplaying the position. It's just historically, you got to be pretty damn good to be in a first rounder as an off-ball linebacker. That doesn't really give much as a pass rusher. I don't think we've seen that from Jacob Rodriguez. I don't think we're going to be talking about this guy being a pass rusher at the next level. So, yeah, great player, though. And we're going to finish up with Alabama edge rusher Yhonzae Pierre. This is another guy that's kind of broke out in 2025. This season, he wasn't listed on the starting depth chart for Alabama this offseason, if I remember right, but Quaver Saw got banged up, so he's really had to step up and, been a big part of this Alabama defense. Really broke out against Tennessee where he had 3 sacks, kind of took advantage of a young offensive line, Jesse Perry, David Sanders Jr., 2 offensive linemen for Tennessee that are both freshmen. Yhonzae Pierre just ate them up. And this is a guy I watched this offseason. I went back to the high school film, him at Eufaula. Really good pass rusher for them. One of the most physical high school films I've ever seen in my life. It's pretty cool to see it translate to the SEC field now because he's having a great season. Does he declare in 2026? This is a guy that has 2 more years of eligibility if he decides to come back to Alabama. I actually think if I had to flip a coin, if I had to guess, I'd say he's probably back at Alabama and doesn't declare until 2027 because I'm not it depends. It depends on a lot of things. Let's just pretend he's coming out in 2026. I think this dude has a day 2 floor. The explosiveness is another guy that's going to test out of the combine. We talked about Cashius Howell. He's not quite the athlete that Cashius Howell is, but I trust Yhonzae Pierre to kind of develop as a edge defender going forward, rather than just be a guy that's going to get after the quarterback like Cashius Howell is. But talking about Yhonzae Pierre, we see a lot of the speed to power stuff as well with him. 3 sacks against Tennessee about a month ago. He also had 2 sacks against LSU yesterday. But you can see just when he gets that first step, when he gets a lot of space in that speed, that area, that space to kind of pick up speed and get into the backfield, he not only has a nice outside move, he not only has an inside move, but he's a really powerful football player when he's given that time. He's another guy. A lot of these edge rushers, it's kind of crazy. Usually we talk a lot about these guys being 6'5", 6'6". Like the only massive edge rusher I can really think of off the top of my head in this 26 class is TJ Parker. So there's a lot of these like smaller, twitched up, great athletes, and I think Yhonzae Pierre kind of fits into that, but I also trust him to develop as an edge rusher a bit more than some of the other guys that we talked about. I think I already said that, but very powerful football player. You see how heavy the hands are, the way he just kind of drives these offensive linemen into the backfield. Great game against LSU. He was the guy that sacked Garrett Nussmeier, and he got benched for that. I mean, Nussmeier, awful season he's having. This is another guy that they were talking about being a first-round pick. I mean, just think about this quarterback class and the way that it's fell off between Nussmeier, Sellers, and then Levitt as well. Levitt's been injured. I think he would have worked back into the first round. But now, I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen with Nussmeier, and it looks like Sellers either going to be back at South Carolina or be in the transfer portal. Don't know if we're talking about him as a draft. But yeah, Yhonzae Pierre, guy that I'm really high on. I'm really excited to get more film on him because, a lot of these other edge rushers, they've been playing a lot of football. Like David Bailey was a big-time guy at Stanford. Cashius Howell, big guy at Bowling Green, and they've kind of transferred and, played well on a big stage. Yhonzae Pierre's been at Alabama for 3 years now, so he is draft eligible. But, all right, geez, I've just been talking about 3 minutes about him. What is my final verdict? Yeah, I think it's a guy that's very much up on the air. The reason we're talking about him is because I do think he's a name to track, right? There's a lot of guys, even at the end of the season, that are not being talked about by the talking heads, Mel Kiper, all those guys as first-round picks, and then, people start watching the film a bit more. They start seeing them at the combine. They do really well in the pre-draft interviews. They have really good combines, and I think he's one of those guys that, if the numbers are good enough, and then you start using the numbers to reference the film. If you watch the film and it's backed up by the numbers and vice versa, I think this is one of those guys that can be one of those, monumental risers in the draft. So we'll talk about that as it goes. Still a ways off, but really like what he's been doing in limited snaps for Alabama this season. That was the 4 players that we're going to talk about this week. We're going to do more next week, so please check out we-draft.com. We're on Instagram, come on, that's such an easy follow. We try to post these guys and then talk about the featured players. If you want to wait until it's actually the draft season, I totally understand it, but I do think if you're interested in the draft, this is kind of a good tool. Like we saw the player page for Mendoza. You just pretty much leave your evaluation. It automatically stores it. I ended up making this because, I do all this talking. I do it on spreadsheets. It's kind of not fun to keep it on a spreadsheet. It's a lot easier on the website to kind of store them. And then you can also see community grades on we-draft.com. So that's my sales pitch. But, yeah, You guys let me know what you think about any of these players. At the end of the day, it's called We Dash Draft. It's not called King Cole Draft. It's called We Dash Draft. I want to hear other people's opinions. I think that's the best way to kind of learn about football is hearing, the consensus and, not just one person talk about it. So please reach out. If it's not on the website, feel free to leave a comment. Love having these discussions. Thanks for watching.